Well, welcome back to the Adoption Law Firm podcast. We are recording live from the Adoption Law Firm new offices. So how fun is that?
Inside view right here.
That's right. You get behind the scenes here. So today we are going to talk about navigating foster care, fostering and adopting through foster care, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a broad topic, but Sam can handle that, of course. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about, you've been a foster parent, so.
Yeah. So our family's kind of adoption foster care story, we started adopting from Hungary while I was in law school. We adopted my oldest son. He was 3 years old, so he was in foster care in Hungary. And that was a very educational experience for our whole family. You know, when I thought of Hungary, I thought like third world country. No, it's like they got their act together. In some ways, I think their foster care system is more stable than the United States. And so he was in the same foster family for the first 3 years of his life before we adopted him. And so, sometimes I articulate that as we adopted out of foster care. It was an international adoption. We got home and we started becoming more aware of the need for caring for at-risk, abused, neglected children, to use biblical words, orphaned children.
Right.
We became more aware of that need in our own backyard. And so we got involved in foster care and we became foster parents. And it was probably one of the most emotionally difficult things that our family has ever done.
Mm. And why do you say that? Like, what was the hardest thing about it?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the history of foster care, probably, before George Mueller came on the scene, if you kind of just track Western civilization, there really was no organized system to care for these at-risk, abused, neglected children, orphan children. And so George Mueller started gathering some of the orphans off of the street and caring for them in an orphanage. Fantastic stories about George Mueller and his faith and his reliance on prayer and God's provision. So the churches started creating these orphanages that were run by churches to care for orphans. Gradually over time, the state really took over that role, caring for orphans. So they became state-run orphanages. And so the church sort of relinquished the jurisdiction to care for orphans to the state. And then as kind of social scientists kind of progressed in their thinking, they thought, all children need to be raised in a family. And then so this foster care movement started happening, and that's really freshly being implemented in some countries like Ethiopia, where they're starting to get their own foster care system off the ground. And so I think part of the difficulty in being a foster parent really isn't working with the kids in your home. A lot of them are coming from horrific abuse, broken bones and neglect and malnourishment and, drug abuse. It's not uncommon for the kids that come into care to be testing positive for controlled substances themselves, whether because they're using controlled substances, whether their parents are giving them, or their environment is just so, like, the air is so saturated with controlled substances. But other kids are in foster care just because their parents were, one parent lost their job and then another parent did. And then the dad, had a bad night and he drank a little bit too much that night. And then the parents had a fight and then an altercation happened and then the neighbor called, and those kind of things could really happen to anybody. So there's a whole spectrum there of why kids end up in foster care, and really the whole trajectory of the foster care system is to be a temporary housing situation while parents get stable housing, stable employment, stable transportation, and get some counseling about how to manage their home better. And that's the ideal situation, that 2 or 3 months later, the parents are doing great and the children are returned to the parents. But I think the difficulty of foster care, what makes it emotionally difficult, is really interacting with a system that isn't the church, right? That a system, right. When the church was in its infancy in Jerusalem, and there was this crisis with widows, right? That was a crisis of who needs the financial resources of the church, who needs the care, the time, the energy resources of the church. So the apostles tasked the church, hey, let's pick men that are full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, right? So full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. So anytime that the government steps in and says, we are going to give assistance to people, that's coming out of a good heart, right? But but to be able to wisely discern how to care for people, how to love for people, what people are in need of resources, and what people shouldn't have those resources because they're just going to use them to their own hurt. That takes people full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. And so I think that's the difficulty when interacting with the foster care system is a lot of people are working social workers, resource managers that are really struggling with just seeing brokenness all the time. And so interacting with a foster care, I love so many people that are working inside the foster care system to try to make a difference. But that sometimes is the most difficult part is trying to care for this child that you love, and interfacing with a system that's also trying to care for the child, but maybe coming from a totally different worldview. Right. They may be totally maxed out, and so that's probably one of the most difficult parts.
Right. That makes sense. So I guess in different states, it's different things. Like it's usually done through DHR in some places, or Child Protective Services in others, and whatever they call that. And it's kind of run that way. But for the most part, everybody has to go through, I'm assuming, classes to become a foster parent and those kind of things and get training.
Right. Yeah. So every westernized country in the world basically has the same system. France, it's actually a career field to be a foster parent, where you get paid a salary and you take in the children that you can take in. In the United States, there's usually some kind of stipend to offset the cost to foster parents. So for the most part, there is a 10-week course. It's one night a week for 3 hours. In Alabama, it's called TIPS. Trauma-informed parenting system, maybe trauma-informed parenting something. But this TIPS class is to train parents for how do we relate to children that are coming from a trauma situation. And that is a completely different strategy, is loving children coming from a trauma situation. Their brain development happens differently. And also, and I think this is a great point, is how do we empathetically relate to parents who have had their children taken into the care, right? Like that could be me. That could be, my kids have done crazy things where my daughter, fell off a stool one time in the kitchen, hit the back of her head, and I had to rush her to the hospital. And like the social worker was poking her head in through the curtain. And it was like, that could have been, that nurse could have made a judgment about us that we were abusing our child. And so a lot of children end up in foster care. And I think we have to empathetically relate to the parents that, sometimes it is because of legitimate abuse, legitimate neglect, right? But still lovingly relate to them. But for Christ, there would I be. I have a log in my own eye. Who am I to cast this condemnation kind of judgment on somebody else? And so that's part of the parenting too, part of the training. Also, I think it's important also for people who are thinking about adoption. Like if you're listening to this podcast, watching this video, and you think, I just know that I want to adopt. I know that that's what God has called me to. The general counsel is probably steer away from foster care, because the whole system is designed to just be a temporary place for a child to stay while the parents get in a more stable life place. And so if you're going into it to adopt, probably you're going to get your heart broken, right? Because those children are most likely going back to the parents. That's the whole drive of the whole system. And probably it's going to be a standard of care lower than what you have in your own home. Doesn't mean it's not an appropriate standard of care.
Sure.
So I think that's important, and that's one of the difficulties too that parents have. That parents that go into foster care knowing I just want to adopt, and then there's this emotional turmoil. Now I will say that the way that the laws are written. In every state, so there's a federal mandate that if a child is in care 15 of the last 22 months, in Alabama, by state law, we've decreased that to 12. Each state is different. But if a child has been in care 15 of the last 22 months, the state child protective system is mandated to start pursuing termination of the parental rights. And the only reason a child, would be in care that long, 99% of the time, is because the parents haven't worked their case plan. They haven't gotten clean drug tests. They haven't stable housing, stable transportation, done the parenting classes. So at some point, there does need to be a shift within Child Protective Services where we say, okay, we're not going to focus on reunification anymore. We're going to focus on the child's best interest and finding a permanent, a loving, stable home for this child. And that is always the first look goes to the foster parents. I mean, that makes sense. They've bonded with the child. They've been
their caregivers for that long.
Yeah. And the science is really interesting. The science shows that, when a child has this bond to a primary caregiver, to disrupt that bond after a certain amount of time, to disrupt that bond is to cause a severe trauma, right? Like the building blocks of our emotional development starts with that bond to a primary caregiver. And you see children who have had those bonds consistently disrupted in early childhood develop things like reactive attachment disorder, right?
Right.
And so we need to really, the whole system needs to shift to, okay, the foster parents love this child. This child came home from the hospital after spending 3 weeks in NICU because of, drug abuse by her mother. And so, now it's been 12 months now, and the mother isn't getting clean drug tests, isn't doing the things laid out in her plan. So let's look to the foster parents adopting the child.
Okay. So my question would be, usually what do they do when they decide that a child needs to go somewhere else because their parents can't take care of them? Then does DHR, CPS, whatever, do they try and look for a family member first, or do they immediately start looking in the foster system?
Yeah, so the first look is to a family member. I mean, that's ideal. I mean, imagine a world where, we live in a communal family compound, and, this is, we had a very interesting case out of Pakistan where it really illuminated that this was the culture was, the grandparents and the kids and the cousins, they all live in the same family compound. Well, if both parents die, well, there's other family members in that compound that can care for the child. Well, because of, our unique brokenness in American society, there's this fracturing of that family unit. And so ideally, when DHR gets the call, hey, whatever's going on with the parents and these kids need to be picked up immediately, DHR, the first thing DHR needs to do is look for, is there an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent that can care for this child? And DHR makes what's called a safety plan with the parents. So a safety plan is where the parents voluntarily consent to, this is where the child needs to go. And then DHR maintains the supervisory role over the case. Now, if there is no safety plan able to be implemented, if there are no family members, then Child Protective Services actually has to go to the court and petition for temporary custody of the child.
Okay. And so they have temporary custody, or?
So the state, yeah. So each county has its own CPS office. So that county, wherever the incident happens, will petition the court in that county for custody of the child. So, if it's Chilton County, Shelby County will say, Your Honor, we need temporary custody of this child because the child is dependent. It has parents that are either unable or unwilling to care for the child.
Okay. All right. I think a great way to kind of land this at the end here is to kind of talk about, there's a lot of myths that surround foster care. And there are a lot of people that when they think of foster care, they immediately go to a negative mindset. And I would love to dispel some of those myths. Tell us what some of the biggest myths about foster care are, and then maybe some things to combat those that are more positive.
Yeah, so I think some of the biggest myths are, no, I could never do that. No, I that's too emotionally difficult. That may be true. Like, nobody needs to get in. We all need to know our capacities. God gives us preferences. And so I think one of the biggest myths is, no, I can't do that. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe, maybe not everybody needs to take, a child with severe special needs where they need to have a feeding tube for the rest. Like, maybe everybody doesn't have that capacity. But I would encourage everyone, and I put myself in this camp included, is, man, let's evaluate that. Like, what did Christ do for us? Like, how much did he extend himself? What did he change about his comfort, his standard? Like, Christ really changed his standard of living to become and be born as a baby, and to the master of the whole universe came to be born as a baby that pooped on himself, and that's shocking, right? Like, he really lowered his standard of living. And so, and he really took on a lot of emotional pain by loving us and bringing us into his family. And, I think there are, if you have other children in the home, I think a wise rule of thumb is don't bring in children into your home unless they're younger than your youngest. I think that's a wise rule of thumb. But there's exceptions to that too. I think, a lot of children that are in foster care, and this is just the culture with the prevalence of pornography, a lot of children have been over-sexualized. And so I think through that and think through, let's put up wise boundaries.
Right.
Another misconception is that foster parents can't hire an attorney to help them articulate their position and what's in the child's best interest. Unfortunately, and this is always trying to be corrected, by, I think, people at a higher level within CPS, but sometimes social workers will almost intimidate foster parents. Like, hey, no, you can't, if you go hire an attorney, we're going to take that child out of your home.
Right.
As an attorney in the legal field, that really gets me riled up because, somebody that's an undocumented immigrant or an illegal immigrant, if they, shoot 3 people in broad daylight, they're legally entitled to an attorney, but to tell a foster parent,
right,
you can't hire an attorney to help you articulate your view of what's in the child's best interest is really just nonsense. And so sometimes, the foster parent's relationship with Child Protective Services can be adversarial in the sense that, if the child has been in their home, if the child came to their home since an infant and the child's been there 2 years and for whatever reason DHR hasn't done TPR, and then this family member comes out of the woodwork that hasn't been involved at all, and if CPS is trying to move the child to this family member, totally disregarding the child's best interests and the trauma that will happen from that separation, sometimes foster parents need to hire an attorney to help them advocate to the courts
Absolutely.
within that system in the most non-volatile way. I think it's really important to try to seed the soil with, and this is just Christian conflict resolution principles, Matthew 18 stuff is how do we try to resolve the conflict in a way that it has the least likelihood of throwing gasoline on the fire, right? Like we want to, to appeal to people, what does it say? The rich person speaks harshly, but the poor person speaks with entreaties. And so I think there's this sweetness of speech that increases. Some people think of, well, when I hire an attorney, I'm going to hire the Alabama Hammer, like the tiger, right? And that's just not our methodology.
To be argumentative or something like
that. Right. No. I mean, my best case scenario is if I'm able to help resolve whatever the situation is with foster parents and DHR is moving in the wrong direction. If I'm able to resolve that just behind the scenes, just giving advice and counsel. Sometimes just having an attorney in the room, unfortunately,
or to just be in a mediator role, just to kind of, this is what, everybody's trying to say without some emotion.
That's right. So it really helping foster parents navigate the foster care system is one of my favorite things to do, because I find that a lot of counties, the foster parents in that county are really uneducated about what their rights are. Like a lot of people don't know there's a foster parent bill of rights. Like you're entitled to notice of court hearings. You're entitled to an opportunity to be heard at court hearings. To, if you're the only person in the room that spent 30,000 hours with a child, it kind of makes sense that your opinion is relevant to what happens with the child.
Absolutely.
You're entitled to, to notice of ISPs and to be able to participate. And so there's this foster parent bill of rights, even just as a base example that a lot of foster parents are unaware of. And unfortunately, we get into situations where the county DHR, CPS isn't following their policy about giving reverence and respect to foster parents. And so I love it. There's a lot of things that I can delegate in my life, but helping foster parents navigate that system is probably one of my favorite things to do.
I love that. I was listening to a podcast recently. They were interviewing a foster parent, and she said the biggest thing that gets told to her as an argument against being a foster parent, I couldn't do that because I could not let a child, get attached to a child and then know that child is eventually going to be taken from my home. Mm-hmm. And her quote was my favorite quote I've ever heard about that, to combat that. And she said, isn't that the way we're supposed to live life in Christ anyway, is open-handed? Yeah. Like with our own children, our biological children, same thing. Our adopted children, you and I both have adopted children, just that we're supposed to live life with the open hand, because they're ultimately Christ's anyway. Mm. And so if we approach foster care and things like that with an open hand and say, they're your child anyway, you could take my biological child tomorrow, God forbid, but they're yours anyway. And so we're to parent them for a season, just like we are our biological children.
That's right.
And so I loved that. That was like my favorite thing that I've ever heard for a foster parent to say about how they approach each child that comes into their home, is that we parent open-handedly with our biological children, our adopted children, our foster children, any of that. Like we parent from an open hand of they're Christ's anyway, and Christ can do what he wants to with them. And if he feels like the best thing for them is to go back with their family, then so be it. That's the way we parent. And I just loved that.
Yeah, every day is a gift with all of our children, whether
Absolutely.
the old-fashioned way or adoption or foster care. Each day is a gift, and really, it takes a lot of trust. But I mean, I think the value to your family of engaging in foster care, if it's the right time, if it's the right fit. Like, one of our favorite families that we've worked with is the Speece family in this small town in Alabama. It's like population, like 1,200, and they have I think 4 older teenagers or young 20s, and they started getting involved in foster care, and they ended up adopting the child that they brought home from the hospital. But it took like 3 or 4 years, which it shouldn't take that long. But just their patience, their love, their kindness I think it was transformative to the entire foster care system in that county. But the point that most comes to my mind is how transformative it was for their older children,
right?
To see, wow, look at the darkness, and what has Christ called us to? Christ has called us to love. And in the short documentary that we did on them, one of the older sons said that the day before the court hearing, where they were praying that the court would decide that the Speece family could adopt this child, he said, that was the first time in my life I ever fasted. And just to see their whole family and the children that mobilized to do what Christ has called us to do was magnificent.
Yes, I love that. So if you guys have any questions about foster parenting or any of that kind of stuff, we love to help you guys. And so we would love to talk to you. So you can call the Adoption Law Firm here in Montgomery, and we would love to discuss that with you and help you on your journey if that is something that you are considering doing. And or if you're a foster parent and you just need some legal help, then we would be glad to help you as well. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for listening to the Adoption Law Firm podcast. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.